Now, what about awareness, let alone interest, in people outside of research circles in that research that we produce? How many influential people in government, politicians and their minders and senior bureaucrats are influenced by our research? I think it's an open yet dark secret in academic circles that the great majority of research makes not even a ripple on the oceans of public opinion, government policy, or even on the pool of knowledge. The rationale for public health and health services research has always been utilitarian. It's not like research in pure maths or literature or aesthetic theory or metaphysics, where questions about usefulness tend to come from Philistines or vulgarians. But with health research, the implication is always that it should help form decision-making. So what do we know about research that is influential in public health? What characterises research which makes a difference, which influences legislative change, funding, policy or practice in ways that millions of people can sometimes come to change their understanding of a health issue? Despite hundreds of millions of dollars of public money being distributed to researchers every year by governments and NGOs in Australia, virtually nothing is known about how to predict research which is likely to make an impact. Internationally, there is quite a modest research literature in this area, and some of the very best of it comes from Canada, from people like Jonathan Lomas and John Lavis, and from Tricia Greenhalgh in the UK. The most common approach in a lot of this research has been to examine the views of public policy makers about the characteristics of research which influences them. In a systematic review of 24 of these studies, which involved looking at over 2,000 interviews, Norwegian Simon Invier and colleagues found that what mattered most in ensuring the impact of research on policy were the following factors: personal contact between researchers and policy makers, timeliness and relevance of the research, inclusions of summaries and recommendations, that the research was of high quality, community pressure, and the effectiveness of data. Now, the factors which were barriers to research influencing policy were remarkably similar. No personal contact between researchers and policymakers, lack of timeliness or relevance, mutual distrust or perceived political naivety of scientists or scientific naivety of policymakers, as seen by researchers, power and budget conflicts, again poor quality research, and political instability and the high turnover of policy staff. Well, I'm not here today to talk about how to improve research quality, nor do I have any glib solutions about the perennial global complaint about the rapid turnover of policy-making staff. But there is a lot which can be said about how researchers can make contact, and especially personal contact, with policymakers, and how research can oxygenate community pressure. Over my career, I have met and got to know quite a few politicians throughout my career. There are many more who I think know me because I've made contact with them, often without invitation. Like most of us, nearly all politicians wake up to a clock radio, which is dominated by news. They read a newspaper at the breakfast table. They have the car radio on as they go to work, again listening to news. On arrival at work, they get briefed by their media advisor. The news media are never far from their minds and are nominated as the most influential source of information by politicians in Australia. Like most of the community, news is where they get their information about everything, including about health. Throughout my career, I've always given very high priority to getting my research into the faces of people who are in a position to act on it, and to the broad community who hopefully in turn will talk about the research and build momentum for change. I write many opinion articles and letters for newspapers. I think they're some of my most important publications. I pester radio and television stations with news. I often distribute papers with summaries to politicians and their staff. This activity often generates requests for further information, but more than that, I think it influences agendas which gradually accumulate to become the way that particular issues are understood by the community and by key decision makers. My recent book explores much of this in greater detail. Now, an example, the decision to ban smoking in restaurants in my home state in 2000 was triggered by an incident in a restaurant when the health minister and his asthmatic children were exposed to a smoker who ignored requests that they move away from the table where the minister was sitting with his children. The minister promptly introduced legislation. This decision, I don't think, came out of the blue, but was fomented by years of exposure to news and news commentary on secondhand smoke, which myth-busted, for example, apocalyptic predictions of economic ruin for restaurants, which provided data on restaurant and bar staff's excessive exposure. All this was framed as sort of neo-Dickensian neglect. You know, we ban smoking in offices for white-collar workers, but bar staff can just sort of get it in the neck. And also with comparisons with other nations' records, including Canada. Now, when I interviewed our former Premier, I asked him if he could recall particular research papers which had influenced his own thinking about such areas of health policy. He looked at me very blank and said that I would have to prompt him. He went on to explain that research was actually mostly brought in post hoc to buttress policy announcements which had already been taken or were about to be made. Policymakers, he said, rarely bathe in research, but instead do what most people do and form their views from what they see and hear in the media and from trusted sources. Take two more recently announced policies from my home state, which have, for example, ended retail tobacco displays and banned smoking in cars when children under 16 are on board. Now, dozens of research papers exist which made the case for these actions, showed the evidence as to why they would be a good thing to implement. And these have been around for over a decade. The research literature explaining policy change emphasises proximal factors, such as the arrival of political leadership supportive of change, windows of opportunity in political calendars, such as early term reforms, energetic policy entrepreneurs in the form of advocates, and the ability of advocates to associate the change that they want with dominant community values, so that failure to adopt policy is interpreted by the electorate as failure to champion such values. But distal or more distant factors like the accumulated research evidence base are vitally important too, because they get the public conversation started and then they reappear as justifications for political decisions. Researchers, I think, need to think very strategically and futuristically about how their research can build the case for eventual action.